evening. I heard your enthusiastic applause as Harold came in the room, which is as it should be. I'm Ann Kirschner, president of Hunter College. Welcome to Roosevelt House, one of Hunter College's treasures. And we're here to celebrate one of Hunter College's other treasures, the prolific Harold Holzer. When I say prolific, I mean prolific because his latest book, brought forth on this continent, Abraham Lincoln and American Immigration, is the latest of 50 books that Harold has brought to life one way or another. I always wondered how Harold could write all of those books while he had so many amazing jobs. He worked for the great Bella Abzug, another Hunter College alum. He worked for Mario Cuomo. He worked for Abe Beame. He spent 6 years as public affairs directors for the PBS flagship station, then 23 years at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and then his wonderful long tenure here as the Jonathan F. Fanton director of the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute at Hunter College. How did he do it? So Harold told me that he'd been fortunate enough to have had a string of bosses who looked the other way. And now that I think about it, Harold, I think you told me that in July when I became president of Hunter College. Not too subtle, was it? But tonight is not a roast, although we could do that one time, but a celebration. Harold is truly one of this country's leading authorities. I guess I can say, or he might have to say it himself, the leading authority on Abraham Lincoln and the political culture of the Civil War era. His work has brought him much acclaim. Lincoln and the Power of the Press won the Gilder Lehrman Lincoln Prize for the best book on Lincoln or the Civil War era. Lincoln at Cooper Union, the speech that made Abraham Lincoln president, won the Christopher Award for books that celebrate the human spirit. And his extensive body of work on Lincoln earned him both the Lincoln Group of New York's Award of Achievement and an American History Book Prize from the New York Historical Society. I could go on, so I will. I will also mention the James Robertson Jr. Literary Prize for Confederate History, the Abraham Lincoln Institute Book Award, the American History Book Prize, and last year, the coveted St. Gaudens Medal, which I actually didn't know about but now have read about. Congratulations, Harold, which he may be wearing today. Are you wearing it today? Oh, he's not wearing it. Okay, forget I said that. In 2008, President George Bush awarded him the National Humanities Medal for his work in making history accessible to a broad audience. So I know Harold mostly from here as director of Roosevelt House. This was once the home of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, as well as FDR's mother, Sarah Roosevelt, right next door. And it's the place where, after being elected in 1932, FDR assembled the key people, the team that gave the United States the New Deal. Under Harold's leadership, this building is our home for public policy and human rights seminars and public programming, and we are a resource to this community as well as to our students. So the publication of this new book could not be more timely with immigration, such an important issue today. To lead the conversation this evening, we are honored and excited to welcome back a good friend, not only of Harold's, but of Hunter College. Stephen Lang is a miraculous and, yes, sometimes a frightening actor. I know, you have to listen to this part, Stephen. So don't distract him, Harold. Stephen Lang is a miraculous... A miraculous and, yes, sometimes a frightening actor on stage. Maybe you saw him in the original production of A Few Good Men on Broadway. Maybe you saw him on television, on Law and Order, Organized Crime, and on screen, my favorite, his Colonel Quaritch portrayal in Avatar, which still haunts my nightmares. And as we were getting ready upstairs, I heard that voice, and I got scared all over again. You did die at the end of that film, right? The first one? Yes? Okay, sorry. Didn't mean to remind you. Stephen Lang is much more than a tough guy. He's an author, playwright, and an expert and creative history advocate who has portrayed iconic characters from George Pickett to Babe Ruth. He has written and performed history pieces here at Roosevelt House, at Gettysburg, at Cooper Union, and at Symphony Space, and I hear Harold has shown up for a cameo or two in some of those productions. Finally, I want to acknowledge that when it comes to the Lang family, we know them too as civic-minded New Yorkers, and through their generous support of the arts, culture, and education through the Family Foundation that was founded by Stephen's father, the visionary philanthropist Eugene Lang. We are so honored and grateful for the Lang family's support of Hunter College and Roosevelt House over these years. And with that, let's welcome to the stage Stephen Lang in conversation with Harold Holzer.
I am Stephen Lang, and it's a true pleasure and an honor, I would add, to be here this evening. My thanks to Hunter College and to President Ann Kirschner, not only for hosting this event, but also for the stewardship of this vital and vibrant institution, the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute. It truly is a municipal treasure. Speaking of municipal treasures, my guest tonight is not really a guest at all, is he? Harold Holzer serves as executive director here at Roosevelt House, which is a perfect match of man and mission. And Harold has had, as Ann pointed out, a fabled career in New York City. Harold Holzer has worn more hats than Bartholomew Cubbins. Historian, author, scholar, commentator, editor, curator, educator, political consultant, journalist, somehow managed to squeeze in 2.5 decades as senior vice president for public affairs at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and he managed the Mets to their first world championship in 1969. That's a lie, it's not true, but like me, Harold is from Queens, born and raised, so yeah, there are some good, smart people from Queens. Not all. He's written over 60 books, hundreds of articles and essays, but tonight we're here to discuss his latest effort, the glowingly received, brought forth on this continent, Abraham Lincoln and American Immigration, no less than Doris Kearns Goodwin, John Meacham, James McPherson, and Bill Moyers agree that Harold wields a golden pen on a timely and timeless subject, writing a book you will not forget. That is called a blurb mash. And I just invented it. Goodwin says that you break new ground, and that is no easy task when we're talking about the most written about of all our presidents. So let's examine some new ground. Ladies and gentlemen, Harold Holzer.
I think we should just adjourn. Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here, and let's start with the obvious. We're going to talk for a while, and then at an appropriate time, we're going to open the floor for some questions from you all. Okay? So I think we should start with the obvious. Apparently, this immigration dilemma has not been solved in well over 100 and more years. So I think it would be valuable, Harold, if you would talk about the state of immigration in the mid-19th century and a little bit before that, about the time when Lincoln first entered politics. What was the federal policy towards immigration, and how did he respond to that? What were what was his stance on it?
So it was easy for Europeans to become Americans. I mean, relatively easy. And I emphasize Europeans because that was the immigration flow. Between Jefferson's presidency and Lincoln's, so after the Alien and Sedition Act was terminated or sunset, you could just walk off, gangplank and register your name, your country of origin, and 5 years later to the date, you could go back and become an American citizen. That's all it took. There was no wall, there was no ice, there was no razor wire. Now, there was resistance in some quarters. There were anti-Catholic, anti-Irish riots in Philadelphia in 1844, just as Lincoln was starting to enter serious politics. He had tried to become a congressman that year and failed. And his party was blamed for it. The Whigs were not welcoming of the Irish, particularly because they tended to vote almost 100% Democratic.
Would it be fair to say that the immigration issue was one of the downfalls of the Whig Party?
Oh, I think so. I think so. I think they mishandled it, and Lincoln goes on record, though, in this year of the riot, saying that the path for immigrants should be clear and open, and the path to citizenship should be open. So it was an entirely different time. It was a period when people were questing for new settlers for this, vast country that did not have a large population.
And when did things tighten up again?
So they tightened, well, because the immigrants took everything seriously and they came. So the Irish are coming.
And Europe was glad to get rid of them,
Ireland is the only country in the world, I think, in the 19th century to lose population. So the famine obviously drove people to the United States, the search for food, but then the failed revolutions on the continent in the late 40s drove the Germans here, and Hungarians, and some Italians, but mostly Germans. So you have a huge number of, this is 5 million people in 10 years coming here in search of food or freedom, and aligning either with democratic politics or with anti-slavery politics.
So would you say that the sheer number of immigrants that were coming in at this point was very frightening to, certain areas of the population here and to the politicians, to the Whig Party?
Yeah, to some.
Sure.
To some, it was frightening, yeah. And the reaction wasn't always a welcome mat, clearly.
Were they encouraged to go west?
Lincoln encouraged them to go west during the Civil War by making the Homestead Act, the free land under the Homestead Act, available to people before they became citizens. But yeah, to some degree, it's interesting. What I found is the Irish were generally a farm population in Ireland. When they came to the United States, they stayed in the cities. They were done with farming. The Germans, who were more cosmopolitan in Europe, tended to go west and create farms. So I don't know, America gave them kind of a new vision of what they should be doing.
And they also gave a big shot in the arm to the fledgling Democratic Party.
Yeah, and even the Germans were originally more democratic, but then after 1850, the German immigration was hugely Republican and anti-slavery. But yeah, they're frightening some people for sure.
So speak about the fright that people had, that these immigrants were coming, they were taking jobs, and some of the things that were written about the immigrants are pretty nauseating to read. It doesn't have anything to do with taking a job or anything else. It has to do with them just being less than human, it seems to me. So can you imagine? It's interesting because when we talk about immigrants, I think we're talking exclusively about white European immigrants. Is that correct? Yeah.
Lincoln's one foray into a different kind of immigration is after the Mexican War. Any Mexican citizen who lived in the regions that the United States took after the Mexican War, or bought, technically, could have the option to become American citizens without waiting even 5 years. But no, at the outbreak of the Civil War, California was 60% foreign-born, mostly Asian, and the impulse was to stop that.
And you never did Lincoln ever opine on the Asian population?
Well, in a kind of negative way, he signed a bill called I hate even mentioning it, was called the Cooley Act of 1862, which and his argument was, and the Republican argument was, that Chinese laborers were being exploited and sent to California to work the mines and the railroads and signing on for kind of a slave trade.
Right.
So the liberals said, this is a slave trade, we have to stop it. Conveniently, they also minimized Asian immigration at the time.
I see.
It wasn't as bad as the Chinese Exclusion Act, but it was kind of a start.
So all of this gave rise to, I think, what we called nativism.
Yeah.
Here, and would you talk a bit about, describe what it is first of all, and then describe Lincoln's rather complex, I think, relationship with it, because if nothing else, well, he was many, many things else, but he was above all a consummate politician, and really knew, I believe, how to, I wouldn't say play both ends, but kind of be in two camps at once. So talk about nativism and about his reaction to it, both personally and publicly.
So this movement started in 1852 or 3, called the Know Nothing movement. The name comes allegedly from the idea that they're having secret meetings to denounce Catholics principally and to find a way to keep them from participating wholly in society. If you knocked on the door and said, what's going on in here? It looks like fun. You're all so lively. They would say, we know nothing. So that's how but it was also known as the American Party, as the nativist movement. And their proposal was to change the 5-year residency requirement for citizenship to 21 years. By the way, if we had 21 years now, we would be taking care of the Dreamers and the DACA students. We would have taken care of it. So it sounded onerous in the 19th century. So Lincoln's view is he doesn't like the movement, obviously. But when the Whig Party falls apart and Lincoln helps create the new anti-slavery Republican Party, he needs to build a broad tent. Mm-hmm. And there are nativists, know-nothing parties, people, American Party members, whom he wants to recruit. And so he does not publicly denounce the know-nothings. There's a really famous letter he wrote in which and it's always quoted by Lincoln biographers, I think incorrectly. He says, I am not a know-nothing. How can I be? How can anyone who abhors the ill treatment of black people be in favor of mistreating white people? It's kind of a reverse kind of a good statement. But Lincoln never made that public. He sent it to his best friend in Kentucky, and his Josh Speed, and Speed didn't release it until after Lincoln's death. So he kept it to himself. And he advises other people, the KNs, as he calls them in his letters, because he doesn't want to say the words, are not tumbled to pieces yet. We need their elements to build the party. The important thing is slavery. So let's use German progressives and some of the anti-immigration people to build this broad tent and fight slavery.
As someone
so he did play both ends.
Yes, and you are, I mean, there are few people who are as expert in Lincoln as you are. Do you find, is there any disappointment in your part on Lincoln's kind of, I would say, waffling on this particular issue?
Yeah, I mean, when I did this book, I admired what he did, particularly once the Civil War started. My disappointment is that all of this, encouragement of German immigration, he also yelled voter fraud whenever he once wrote a letter and said, I saw some Irishmen carrying carpet bags. This is in the day before carpetbaggers became a thing. It was luggage. Carrying carpet bags at the railroad station. They are here just to vote illegally against me for the Senate. We should hire detectives to follow them and prevent illegal voting. So fake votes by immigrants were a thing even then. What other disappointments? Lincoln had no sympathy for indigenous people. When I say he provided homestead land for European-born people, they were lands that had been lived in and farmed by indigenous people. But Lincoln, he was a product of his times. His grandfather, Abraham Lincoln, had been killed by Native Americans.
In Kentucky, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He had fought in an Indian war himself, kind of
As it were.
as it were. He said the only blood shed was that taken by mosquitoes, but that's, that was the war.
But he also said it was the thing he was proudest of in his life was being the captain, elected captain.
Being elected captain, right.
During the, what's the war? It's
The
not
Black
Chippewa,
Hawk,
the
Black Hawk
the
War
Black Hawk
against
War.
the Sauk Indians.
Yeah.
So he met with native chiefs once in the White House and spoke to them, as if it was a movie of the 1940s. You important people, me big chief, that kind of thing. So, he was limited in that way. And he preferred immigrants to be, nascent Republicans. Not, if the Irish were going to be Democrats, he would just assume they didn't come until the Civil War.
And he did. I mean, he had within his own inner circle, I think he did have a goodly share of immigrants. He had close relationships. You brought up voter fraud. I thought maybe you'd speak about that a little bit more and the stuffing the ballot box during this particular period, which, these allegations of voter fraud, they're pretty much familiar to all of us, and I think they're going to play big. As this year progresses, it seems to me. So, what can you share from Abraham Lincoln that's going to give us all a better perspective on the election that is to come?
He learned eventually that people had the right to vote. I mean, he allegedly once broke up an Irish mob that was preventing Germans from voting in his hometown. He came down with the story is too good to be true, with an axe handle. I mean, this is a guy who was already famous for wielding an axe and broke up the crowd. I can't quite see that happening. But he eventually favored the right of non-citizen immigrants to vote in municipal elections in Illinois. And even immigrants who had never gotten citizenship but had arrived in Illinois before the state constitution defined voting rights, he thought they should vote in presidential elections. And there were still people who were living in Illinois who antedated the Constitution. So he was progressive about it. And but as now, allegations of voter fraud were wildly exaggerated. The Germans said the Irish were voting illegally. The Irish said the Germans were voting illegally. Everybody was working really hard to get access to the ballot.
And they weren't really secret ballots at that time, were they?
No. Here's how you voted. First of all, there's another misnomer. I see from Civil War friends here who know this. They say Lincoln wasn't even on the ballot in the South when he ran for president. There was no ballot. There was no piece of paper and you wrote the name of, you checked off a name. You got a ballot before you went in from your party. It was a printed ballot. Some had decorations or shields or flags or pictures. And you brought that in and you deposited it in a giant fishbowl. Not secret ballot. You went on the Republican line or the Democratic line. So no secret ballot. And even if you just carried a newspaper in your hometown, people knew what party you were in. If you carried the New York Times in New York, you were a Republican. If you carried the New York Herald, you were most likely a Democrat. The New York World, definitely a Democrat. The Tribune, a Republican. So people carried those badges.
Is it possible, speaking of immigrants and voter fraud here, is it possible that one of Lincoln's most trusted allies, and I'm talking about his the one who is described as the Cerberus, his Cerberus.
His Teutonic Cerberus
his
at the
Teutonic
gate.
Cerberus, John Nicolay, did he vote fraudulently?
Yeah, we kind of think so now. I did this book. I researched it during the pandemic. It was hard to go around to a lot of the places I usually do research in, so I did a lot of this online. But a young scholar of my acquaintance who turned 100 on February 5th, my birthday. I love talking to him because he makes me feel so young.
So spring has sprung.
Exactly. He said, "You've got to see this research I have." I said, "I'm probably not going to write another book," because he was 98 at the time. And he said, John Nicolay never got his citizenship papers. So if he voted for Lincoln in 1860, this was his private secretary. Johann Nicolai, who became John Nicolai in America, never bothered to get his citizenship papers, got away with it. But as you said, when you said Lincoln was surrounded by people, Nicolai had a German accent.
Right.
There were people in the sphere in the White House who spoke with German accents and Irish accents.
One of the names that we see plastered around New York quite a lot is Schurz.
Carl Schurz.
Carl Schurz. And I'd like to, the only name you see more of is Kosciuszko, and we're not going to talk about him, But I'd like you to give a little bit of a riff on some of the personalities who Lincoln did deal with, and I think Carl Schurz is the perfect one for this particular audience.
So this is a German immigrant who was actually in the revolutions of 1848, 20 years younger than Lincoln. He comes here, moves to Wisconsin. Very much like Lincoln, he runs for the state legislature before he gets his law license. Then he gets his law license. And he rises in Republican politics. And at the 1860 convention, he does not support Lincoln. But when Lincoln wins the nomination, he pledges his support. And in those days, candidates didn't really campaign for themselves. So surrogates did the campaigning. And Carl Schurz spoke in German to prospective voters in Wisconsin, Illinois, Ohio, Indiana, and expected to be rewarded with a patronage job once he did noble service for the party. And Lincoln was not really that quick in rewarding him. He wanted to be ambassador to Mexico. He wanted to be ambassador to Germany. From whence he fled. William Seward, the Secretary of State, didn't think a revolutionary should get a good ambassadorship to the crowned heads of Europe because he served as a threat. He finally got appointed ambassador to Spain. Then he said, I don't want to go. I want to raise a regiment, a German regiment. Lincoln said, it wasn't easy to appoint you. He came to New York, but he was too late. He couldn't raise a regiment. He went to Madrid. He bought a fancy uniform to be presented at court. He couldn't stand it. He came back, and he did become a general.
Right.
Not a great general.
No.
And always a very tough critic of Lincoln. When the Emancipation was issued in 1862, and as Lincoln had expected and feared, the off-year congressional elections went against his party in a big way. Schurz went nuts.
Well, what is the achievement for which we laud Schurz then?
Well, he has a park, I think.
Yeah, I know. A lot of guys don't have parks. I'm just wondering why he does.
He rallied the Germans to an anti-slavery position. And he did fight well at Gettysburg, right? Where we're going someday soon. Yeah. There was another German general who Lincoln encouraged. He wanted ethnic generals. And at a Union Square rally right after Fort Sumter, Irish and German pledged their support for the Union. The Irish speaker said, we didn't like Lincoln, but where this flag was traduced at Fort Sumter, we're going to support it. Right. So Lincoln loved the idea of having ethnic regiments and ethnic commanders, Irish Democrats, German Republicans.
Garibaldi Brigade,
Well, I have to tell you a quick story about the Garibaldi.
Please, I want to hear more.
Garibaldi Brigade was one of the first organized in New York. Hungarians, Italians, Poles. I see a whole panoply of people sitting here who trace themselves back to all of these generations. And the colonel was a Hungarian named Frederick Dutasi, right? And unknown to the story. It turned out that he was a German veteran named David Strasser. He had just invented the name Dutasi. And he had been imprisoned in Germany as a horse thief. So they put him in charge of a cavalry unit. This is like what Willie Sutton said, why did you rob banks? Because that's where the money is. So he came to camp, and what does he see in this camp? Horses. Dutasi tried to steal the horses, and he wound up spending much of the Civil War in Sing Sing.
Which was actually kind of a light sentence, because the sentence punishment for horse thievery at this particular time was being hung by the neck.
Yeah, you could be executed for that.
Yeah, in fact, because horses were pretty important property to people.
Lincoln listen, when Lincoln, they turned the other cheek because the idea was to get more and more ethnic recruits. So,
Talk about the Irish
yeah,
a little bit as
Michael
well.
Corcoran was the first Irishman recruited to raise a regiment. He had just been court-martialed for refusing to assemble the Irish brigade to welcome the Prince of Wales to New York. He said, I'm not welcoming the heir to the British throne. So he's court-martialed. Then the war comes. He's forgiven, right? What court-martial?
Right.
He's there. Thomas Francis Marr was his deputy.
Because Corcoran got taken immediately. He was in prison.
He was imprisoned in
Did he ever
Richmond.
get paroled? Did he get paroled during
he did.
the war? He did.
In late '62. He spent a year in prison. He was captured at Bull Run. Thomas Francis Marr takes over. He's kind of flaky, but another great poster boy.
Right.
Lincoln even sends for an Irishman named James Shields. James Shields had been an Irish politician in Illinois, and Mary Todd and Abraham Lincoln had co-authored a vicious satire about him, saying he thought of himself as a ladies' man. He wasn't. He never bathed. Vicious stuff. So Shields demanded to know who wrote it and challenged Lincoln to a duel. And dueling was illegal in Illinois, so they went to Missouri. Lincoln chose broadswords as the weapon.
Right.
And then he practiced by shearing off the branches of trees with his long arms. And only then did Shields say, maybe we should just shake hands.
Let's talk
Yeah,
about Let's talk about this. You brought up axes before, and I don't know. You can tell us if this is true. I have heard that Abraham Lincoln could hold an axe out straight with his arm by holding it between his thumb and his forefinger.
And you couldn't do that if you had Marfan syndrome. or any
Arnold
other.
Schwarzenegger could not do that.
He did it on his last boat ride home from visiting the Army of the Potomac. He would love it if there were young men on the ship or anywhere he was, and he would find an axe. Can you do this? And he would hold it out, and nobody could do it.
Nobody
Yeah,
could. No,
yeah.
he was.
So anyway, he welcomed Shields to the Army as well. All these people were disasters. My favorite, I didn't tell you about my favorite, General Alexander Schimmelpfennig. a wonderful name, another recruiting magnet. Schimmelpfennig is joining. We have to join. But on the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg, Schimmelpfennig got a little spooked, and he hid under a porch in a pigsty, basically,
Yes.
for 3 days. Who found him? Carl Schurz. They'd known each other in Germany. Alex, where have you been? I don't know what happened.
And why are you wearing a dress?
Right.
Well, while we're on the subject of kind of some of his more eccentric friend, this one's not so military, but talk a little about the presidential chiropodist.
Oh, Dr.
Issachar
Zachary.
Issachar Zachary.
He was an English Jewish foot doctor. The only thing is he kind of invented the medical history. He allegedly plagiarized a book and published it as his own. And he went to treat Lincoln. He had been recommended by others. He had treated Henry Clay once. So when he treated Lincoln, the press said, now Lincoln has feet of clay. That's it, yeah. We both killed that line together.
Yeah, we blew it. Yeah.
Lincoln loved him. He was able to remove corns or bunions and fit him for shoes, and he became the self-described chiropodist to the Union Navy, to the Union Army, not the Navy. And then he went around to cities like New Orleans and Richmond as Lincoln's representative to the Jewish community in captured Confederate cities, and campaigned for him. He was very full of himself, and he inspired some of the most vicious anti-Semitic commentary by people he encountered in these cities. But Lincoln stayed faithful to him, even though he was apparently a complete fraud.
Right. Yeah, he never gave up on him, I don't think.
No. But he tried to collect after Lincoln's death. Here's my bill.
He did.
And they did not pay the bill.
They wouldn't
the
pay
Union
that.
Army did not
embittered
pay.
him.
Yeah.
So, okay, we've talked about the Irish a little bit about the Italians. What about, and we've mentioned the indigenous people, that his record with the American Indians is not good. What about, how do we equate immigrants and his feelings about slavery and blacks? How do the rights of these people in mid-century, what contributed to his views on this?
So Lincoln was always anti-slavery. He wanted slavery to be put, as he said, on the course of ultimate extinction. Even that meant a very slow path to freedom. The war gave him the opportunity to act more quickly than he thought he had a right to under the Constitution. And he came much more slowly to black rights than he did to immigrant rights, to be frank about it. But I always point out that, and he's taken a lot of heat reputationally for some of his early comments were kind of reprehensible, especially when he felt cornered in the 1858 Senate campaigns, and he said things like, do I want Negroes to be on juries or to vote? Absolutely not. But then he added, just because I don't want a black woman for a wife, it doesn't mean I want her for a slave. In her right to eat the bread that she makes with her own hands, she's my equal and the equal of everyone else. Anyway, his last speech, April 11th, 1865, he didn't know it was his last speech, but it was a speech on Reconstruction. And he said that to a huge throng on the White House lawn, the time has come to give black men, right, it's only men who vote, the right to vote, even if we start with the very intelligent and those who fought in the army. If you look at it from 2024, it sounds like means testing, it sounds like limitation. But he's the first American president to ever publicly declare for black voting rights. And who was in the audience that night? An actor, an out-of-work actor. You can guess who he is. Mm-hmm. And he turns to his friend in the audience and says, that means Negro equality. And he didn't use the word Negro, as you can imagine. That's the last speech he'll ever make. And 3 days later, he shot him. I believe because civil rights was on Lincoln's post-war agenda.
You talk about, so, I mean, did Lincoln come around on slavery? Is it, we talk about people evolve, our thoughts and opinions are always evolving. And sometimes that can kind of be used as a bit of an excuse for past bad behavior, it seems to me. But I think you're suggesting that Lincoln's views did, in fact, sincerely evolve.
I think on all these issues. Correct? On all these issues.
Yeah.
First of all, the war was a laboratory for proving patriotism. So ethnic groups that he had disliked because they were opposed to him became closer to his heart. He owed a debt to black regiments, clearly. 180,000 black soldiers fought in the Civil War. They died at a higher rate than white soldiers. And the negative is that they got paid less at the beginning of the war. But that evolved too.
When we talk about, I think it's a fact that the state of New York contributed more men to the fight to fight for the Union than any other state, including Pennsylvania, which I think contributed quite a few. How many of the people who came from New York actually came just kind of through New York? In other words, got off the boat and basically took the bounty and signed up.
Yeah. So there was a lot of anger in England, for example, that the Irish. Well, I should preface it by saying the one big news, the big ticket item of the book is that Lincoln proposed an immigration reform bill to set the stage for the boats in 1863. And it was an extraordinarily liberal idea, not only to create the first Federal Bureau of Immigration, not only to expand Castle Garden, which was the landing spot for immigrants in New York. 70% of all immigrants came through Castle Garden. But he also said there's been so much waste of manpower in this country. Hundreds of thousands had died. Hundreds of thousands would never work again if they were injured or ill. We need to bring immigrants here. They are going to rescue this country. And he offered he suggested that the federal government pay for immigrants to come to the United States.
How'd that go? How'd that fly?
It did not go well. But the difference though is that Congress passed a different version. The House and Senate reconciled, and then they actually voted for the bill that they did. Unlike today, where they create a bill and then they say, I never heard of that bill, and they don't vote for it. So the reform bill at least created a system, it's kind of very American capitalistic, for private industry to underwrite voyages, and then people would have to pay back like a mortgage over 10 years. A certain amount of their salary.
And understand, I think, that when we think of the immigrants coming in, we do think of them going kind of straight into the military.
Right.
But in fact, many of the immigrants were coming in to go work either in agriculture or in the mines, because the nation's
inducements.
workforce was so badly depleted at this point.
But impoverished people who came here already owing a debt for the passage, and if they were given a $300 bonus, that was a year's wages in Ireland at the time, or nearly a year's wages. So it was also a good deal. They weren't taken off the boat like in the Gangs of New York movie. They weren't.
But there were, I mean, what I've read is that there were large posters.
Yeah, there was a recruiting station a couple of blocks away.
And I think what they did was what I've read is that and it's terrible, they recruited the Irish with whiskey, and they recruited the Germans with martial music.
Yeah. There's a great cartoon that the English.
What did they do for the Hungarians?
Stew. Goulash, I don't know. But the Irish and the Germans were the principal migrants at that time. And yeah, the British were furious because they thought they were losing population in Ireland, and they were resentful.
Right.
You're interested in the Hungarian side, clearly, because of your
I'm just curious.
antecedents. But your family didn't come during this. Your Hungarian side didn't come here during that period, right?
No, we didn't get here till a couple of weeks ago, actually. Historically speaking, I would say.
I looked up names of Civil War soldiers, and I found one with not one, but 20 with the name Volmar.
Yeah.
Right? That's your mother's name. I found a Giuseppe Raffa Matilda. The great Matilda Cuomo is here, and I want to welcome her. So I found a Giuseppe Raffa from Brooklyn who enlisted obviously before your family's time coming to America, but yeah, they were. It's extraordinary. You can find any name in the records. Maybe not Carolyn Maloney's name because she's a Southerner. So
Well, just to move backwards a little bit, we've talked a little about immigration as progressive, extending beyond Europeans, which it really didn't. How did it impact his run for U.S. Senate when he was running against and his debate with Douglas, with Stephen Douglas? Was immigration an issue that they would get into? Did they tangle over it?
They did. Douglas charged that Lincoln wanted black Americans to vote, but didn't want Irish Americans to vote. And it was very contentious and very ugly.
And not true, right?
Probably not true on either count, actually, as it happened in 1858. But Lincoln finally was compelled to confront it, and he said, I want an America where Hans and Baptiste and Patrick can have access to all the land in the West. And then he made a speech around July 4th that I talk a lot about when I talk about this book around the country. Lincoln had just avoided a German picnic on July 4th, 1858. I don't know why he didn't go. It was a perfect political event, right? An ethnic event.
Well, he always had health issues, didn't he? Not always.
Not always,
he
but
had
but
his
he
share.
can, I mean, he gave 190 speeches in that campaign. He could have gone to Chicago. Anyway, he's in Chicago on the 11th, speaking after Douglas the night before. He sees a vast crowd, and he looks in the audience, and he sees this very tall guy named Anton Hessing, who was the leader of the German community, and whom he just disrespected by not going to his picnic. So he goes into this riff. It's July 4th. I know we're celebrating, I'm paraphrasing heavily here, I know we're celebrating the founders of this country and their descendants who are descended, from this great generation who created our government. But I also see people here who are not descended from the founders, who have come here more recently. And I want to tell them, I want to tell all of you that you are the blood of the blood and the flesh of that founding generation, because the Declaration of Independence that they created says so. He never said that they were poisoning the blood of this country. I don't say that in the book, but I hope it's implicit. He said that new arrivals were the blood of the country. And that really did set him apart in 1858.
Lincoln spoke no other language beside English, I believe.
He took German lessons for a while because he wanted to speak to potential constituents. But according to someone who was in the class, he joked around so much that nobody learned any German. So it didn't work. He could say a few. He met a guy named George Schneider, who was a very important Chicago editor, and he said, "Schneider, I know what that means. You're a tailor." So he retained a few words, but no, absolutely not.
Right. It's interesting that you say he joked around. Because of course Lincoln was an inveterate joke teller, and so many of the jokes that he did tell were in all probability ethnic jokes.
Yeah.
He told jokes about Irishmen, about black people, about whatever, probably about Mexicans, and it was that sort of, I wouldn't say he was the Don Rickles of his time, but he was not shy about using some really, really negative humor as well.
Well, he loved doing brogues, that's for sure.
He liked to do brogues.
He did like to do brogues, and
it could make him. The Irish could make him cry too. I've read. Yeah.
The music could make him cry. No, but he told Irish jokes until the last week of his life. General Sherman said, "What do we do about Jefferson Davis? He may try to escape now that the war has ended. What should we do?" And he said, he wouldn't answer directly. He said, "It reminds me of a story of an Irish alcoholic back in the West, and he finally went on the wagon, and he came to a big celebration, and they said, 'We'd like to give you some lemonade.' And he said, 'Thank you, sir. And I wouldn't mind if you put a little bit of the draft in the lemonade, but unbeknownst to me.'"
Don't let me know.
So Lincoln says to Sherman and Grant, "That's how I think you should treat Jefferson Davis, but unbeknownst to me." He didn't want his fingerprints on his escape. He really wanted Davis to just leave the country, which didn't happen.
Yeah. Can you? I never like to have a conversation without getting into Gettysburg just a bit. How does immigration fit into the Gettysburg Address, as far as you're concerned?
I thought you were going to ask me about the battle, because it was certainly
and about the battle.
The Irish Brigade and
sure.
and Schurz fought well at Gettysburg, but
and how do soldiers fight when they actually don't speak English? I mean, a lot of the recruiting was done in foreign languages, I think.
But there was a rule at the beginning of a regulation that you had to speak English to be serving in the armed forces. That's another thing they ignored.
Got rid of that,
right?
Yeah.
And so there was a chain of command problem where the English-speaking commander had to speak to a German-speaking general. So at the Gettysburg Address, the Gettysburg Address is all-inclusive. It's all-embracing. And when he says "of the people," I think he means all the people that he's created in this new family of America. But the Gettysburg Address is not explicit about anything. It's broad and it's generic.
It is, and it's also a proposition, it seems to me, which is to say he's floating an idea,
right,
to be discussed. And to me, what he does when he does that is that's the very definition of democracy itself, the proposition that all men are created equal, which obviously does relate heavily to immigrants, to indigenous folk, to slaves, to all of us. All mankind is created equal. He says it. It's general, and it's very, very sturdy and explicit, it seems to me.
And I was there when, a few years ago, when Stephen was invited to recite the Gettysburg Address on its anniversary in Gettysburg. It turns out not on the spot where he delivered it, but who knew, right? But thousands of people on a very cold day. We were cuddled under a blanket before you got up, but maybe we shouldn't talk about that part. But it was so brilliant and so moving, and still on YouTube.
Now
somewhere.
you know why I brought it up, right? It's enough, Yeah. When Lincoln was serving as president, what did he say directly about immigration?
He said that immigration is ultimately his last big statement. Immigration is created by Providence, not Rhode Island, God, to enrich our country. That was a huge thing for him because he had also said that God directed the Emancipation Proclamation once the Union had won the Battle of Antietam. He didn't want the cabinet to talk about it. I made a pact with God that if we won the battle, I would issue the proclamation. He said he would say in a couple of weeks in the second inaugural, if every drop of blood drawn with a lash has to be repaid by one drawn with the sword, then, as was said 3,000 years ago, and this is scripture, then the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. And he's saying the same thing about immigration. It's providence, it's providential, it's a way to replenish this devastated country.
Do you think, we're going to open it up for questions and I just want to ask one or two more things. Do you think that his feelings, his beliefs about providence, do you think they evolved as well? Was Lincoln a believer from the very beginning, or did his experience, the pain of the life that he led, the decisions and choices he had to make?
It's a great question. And when I look at Matilda and Maria, I think of, this is the question I talked about almost every week with Mario Cuomo. He loved talking about Lincoln's religion, whether it was sincere, whether it was the result of an evolution. My view was, which he didn't buy 100%, was that Lincoln couldn't deal with the death toll. He needed to share responsibility with a higher power. So he said, if God wills that the war continue, it's out of his hands.
Yeah.
So I think he turned increasingly. I mean, this is a guy who never went to church after his boyhood, disdained organized religion, was kind of a deist, right? He wasn't a fundamental Christian. And yet I think his reliance was provoked by the horrible situation.
It's very, very, it's beautiful in its way, tragic and beautiful, because he's not a man who was born to it. So many of us are born into a religion, will we or nill we, and it's ours to accept or ultimately reject. Lincoln came to it out of need, I think, and that's such a, human thing to do, such a vulnerable thing to do. And I think when you look at the magnificent portraits, photographic portraits of Lincoln, I think you can see the pain and the need, and not just the worry and the care, but the actual need that he had. One last question, and then I'll ask you for questions. You're so careful, I think, in the book, in this marvelous book. Isn't it? It really is just a wonderful book, I think. And I hope you all read it. But you try not to make obvious references to the current struggles that we're having, immigration. But you're not writing tonight. We're just talking, right?
Right.
So what do you feel about it? What are the true parallels? And why is so little changed? Why does the know-nothing still exist in the way that it does?
Because people who come through the golden door sometimes want to close it to the next aspirants to the kind of opportunity that we uniquely provide. It's tragic, but it's a thread through American history, and between the last law Lincoln created in pro-immigration law in 1865, it took 100 years for another pro-immigration law, Lyndon Johnson's 1965 act, opening the door to those who had been displaced by Vietnam and Cambodia and Southeast Asia. And now it's going on 60 years.
And they'll slam that door again
Yeah.
if they can.
It's going on 60 years. So I don't know. At some point, we have to stop and look at the country that has evolved. Speaking of evolution, we're diverse, and we can be more diverse. We're a multiplicity of immigrants, and we can welcome more multiples. And we're the only country that people want to come to generally. And we should be so proud of that and so encouraging. I don't say it directly in the book, but when I'm asked at these events, it's interesting. I've spoken in progressive areas and conservative areas, and nobody has objected to that as a principle. I haven't had any pushback on it. I just wish we could find the will to. I mean, here at Hunter, right? We just started classes again today after the break, and I got to speak to some of our students who are engaged in original research projects on the humanities. They're from all over the world, and they're from such a panoply of countries, and they do this great work, and they take care of their extended families. They help take care of siblings, of grandparents, and the fact that some of them do not have official status in this country, I think, is just a tragedy.
And just to sort of examine the other side of that coin for a second, how insupportable is it to be part of a country that does not welcome people, that is negative in that way, that our stance is we don't want you here? I mean, I just feel that it's shameful that people would feel that way. You know, if you ever go down to Gettysburg in November 19th, which is Dedication Day down there, the day that traditionally the Gettysburg Address is delivered, one of the most moving part of that entire yearly annual ceremony is the swearing in of new citizens. People from all over the globe take the oath of citizenship in this country, and it's traditionally, I feel proud on a day like that to be an American.
And I don't think any of us here could pass the test that they have taken to get to that point. It is really tough.
Yeah, it's a good thing we're citizens already, right?
Exactly.
Exactly. And in any case, I think we should probably open it up now to the audience to get a few questions, shall we? The gentleman right here, you had your hand up. Yep.
Maybe it's irrelevant, but I know there was a Jewish community that was in the United States. Did Lincoln have an awareness and what relationship with them, and what was his attitude?
Yeah, no, it's not irrelevant. The Jews were a very small percentage of the American population before the war, but he befriended a Quincy, Illinois lawyer named Abraham Jonas, who was a Jewish guy from, he's English, he was from Great Britain. And he was a Whig who became a Republican. He was anti-slavery. Lincoln actually made his widow a postmaster after Jonas died to help take care of him. He had some Confederate. He had 11 children. So he allowed the Confederate son to come to his father's deathbed. But the biggest test, he passes the test of some of my best friends are Jewish. That test he passes. More to the point, when Ulysses Grant issued Order Number 11 in 1862, banning Jews as a class from his area of command in the West, provoked by his father's experience with a Jewish business partner, whatever. It was really dumb. And it created a pogrom in at least one city, Paducah, Kentucky, where Jews just took flight. But Jewish leaders wrote to Lincoln, including Isaac Cincinnati, who was a Democrat, by the way. And Lincoln received a Jewish delegation in the White House, and he very gingerly overturned the order. Didn't want to do it to humiliate Grant, because Grant was a very valuable military asset. So he had his general-in-chief countermand. Halleck did it. So that was his big test, and he passed the big test. By the way, the last doctor
good for the Jews.
Good for the Jews. The last
Unbalanced.
the last doctor who tried to save his life was a fascinating ophthalmologist named Alexander Lieberman from Latvia, a Jewish doctor from Latvia.
Makes you wonder where his chiropodist was at this time.
He was not
Where
at the.
was he when we needed him?
Well, you know, his eye swelled. Not to be too graphic, his eye swelled so much that they thought an ophthalmologist might be able to intervene and help, but he was, beyond help.
Who else has a question?
Bill has a
Okay.
question here.
Yes? Okay.
You talk about the know-nothings, and then at the end you talk about the closing of the golden door. I wonder if you could talk about, was there anti-immigration rhetoric talking about how the know-nothings or those who are anti-immigration were hypocritical, given how much more recently than today those people and their forebears would have come to this country?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there was a resistance to nativism, particularly among Irish leaders. And New York had an archbishop named Dagger John Hughes. Why he was called Dagger John, I've forgotten, but he was a tough guy. And he was the leader of the resistance to the know-nothings. He was an advocate for government aid to parochial schools, which was even more controversial than it is today. Seward, as a governor, supported parochial aid, parochial school support by the government. So yeah, there was definitely pushback from enlightened Republicans, and the movement faded. But it had a moment. In 1856, the nativists ran a presidential candidate. It defeated the Republicans in their first run for the presidency because they ran an ex-president, Millard Fillmore. He got 22% of the vote. That's how much of the American population wanted foreign immigration curtailed. So it was a big group. And then it faded. What do they say about third parties? They're like a bee. They sting and then they die.
Yes. Patrick Falsey, you have a question?
Yes, General and Harold. Gettysburg question. Do I need this?
Yes, you have to.
Okay.
We have a Zoom audience, so you definitely.
Hello. Anyway, Gettysburg question. Right after the Battle of Gettysburg, riots are going on here in New York City, the Irish. And now Yankee troops are coming in from Gettysburg to put down the Irish here in New York City. Did Lincoln think that he would lose the Irish vote because of this?
So, yeah, I avoided talking about the New York draft riots, but leave it to you to bring it up. It's serious. So, yeah, it was largely an Irish uprising. They had been overstimulated, what is the word, driven to the brink by
Ginned up.
by anti-Republican newspapers who said, look, the draft law was stupid, okay? It had a $300 exemption if you could pay for a substitute. So every impoverished person in New York was not going to be able to avoid the draft, but rich people could. And they inflamed, that's the word, inflamed into, and on, the opening of the draft on 3rd Avenue and 49th Street, it's so interesting to imagine it. Someone threw a brick through the draft window, and then this mob kept getting bigger and bigger. They marched up to 59th Street. They went west, then they went south down 9th Avenue, and they basically attacked Irish Unionists. They attacked Republicans. They looked for Horace Greeley. They tried to close down and burn the New York Times and the New York Tribune. And in the worst moment, they attacked what was called the Colored Orphans Asylum on 5th Avenue and 43rd Street, 43rd, right where the construction is next to the Century Club. You can see it now. That was the what do you call
And the kids were saved by an Irishman.
an
I might
Irishman.
add.
They were. They were saved by an Irish. Well, first these 240 black kids are in this orphanage, and they're being blocked from leaving. And one kid says to the minister, "You always said to follow the good book. If you hold it up, we'll follow you." And they walked out. They were taunted, but an Irish kid said, "Follow me." And he took them to a police station on the Lower East Side, and the kids were evacuated to Roosevelt, what is
The
now
draft
Roosevelt
riots
Hill.
are a really vast. So it's an
Yeah.
evening in and of itself, I think. So let's move on to another question. I saw a hand back there. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for this wonderful discussion. If Lincoln were alive today, what party would he be affiliated with? And also, if he were alive today and running for president, could he be elected?
Well, the second part is easier. I know people say, he was unelectable because he was, homely and awkward, but he was a brilliant politician. So my assumption is, if there's a Lincoln out there who may not look like Robert Redford, he'd still be so brilliant at politics, he would be electable. And I'm asked this question all the time. I have no clue. I mean, I assume he'd be a member of the Democratic Party. The Republican Party is the flip side. It's the Democratic Party of the antebellum period. It's the party that resists inclusion and, in my humble opinion, a fellow historian was asked in Time magazine a couple of months ago, it's also unanswerable in some way, and sometimes we should just say we can't answer, but who would Lincoln vote for in 2024, Biden or Trump? And he said Trump because he was a loyal Republican. That guy has suffered every attack that maybe he deserves for fooling around with that one. But I assume, he was a progressive and he was inclusive, and he was for government action. So,
I
Right?
suppose it would be great, though, if he would lead the Republican Party. If he were here to lead the Republican Party back to a place of sanity, that would be good too. In any case, I think I'll take one more question, and then we'll end.
adjourn.
Yes, ma'am, at the end there. Yes.
Him.
Oh,
He.
I thought it was.
Guy. Is it true that Lincoln's last words were, "Nobody will care"?
He has almost.
He had asked, I think his wife, he wanted to hold his wife's hands, right?
I think his
before-
last words were, "No one will think anything of it."
Ah,
He was holding his wife's hand at the theater, and she said, "What will people think
yes.
that we're holding hands like school children?" And he said, I don't think they'll think anything of it.
That seems. I
maybe
think
no
it's
one knows,
I
but-
think it's important to end with Lincoln's words, but that's a bit too melancholy. So I think that we're going to end this discussion with his message to Congress in 1864, and he said, "The war continues. While it is melancholy to reflect that it has filled so many graves and carried mourning to so many hearts, I regard our emigrants as one of the principal replenishing streams which are appointed by Providence to repair the ravages of internal war and its waste of national strength and health." And with that,